Ever wondered what it was like to voluntarily give up your manhood for a government job? In 17th century Korea, thousands of men made exactly that choice, and what happened to them after death reveals one of history's most shocking burial practices. Picture this. You're a poor farmer's son in Joseon Korea, watching your family struggle to put rice in their bowls while the local nobleman's horses eat better than you do. Then someone tells you about a career opportunity that pays 5 times what your father makes, comes with job security until death, and even includes a retirement package. The catch? You have to let someone remove your testicles with a rusty blade, while thunder masks your screams. Sounds like a nightmare, right? For thousands of Korean men, it was their dream job. The year is 1650, and Korea's Joseon dynasty has been perfecting the art of creating palace eunuchs for over 2 centuries. But these weren't your typical Chinese-style eunuchs, who got everything chopped off and spent their lives as bitter, sexless servants. Korean eunuchs kept their ability to have relationships, could legally marry, and often became some of the most powerful people in the kingdom. They called themselves naesi, and they were about to rewrite everything you think you know about castration and career advancement. Here's what's absolutely wild about this story. While European peasants were dying of plague and living in their own filth, Korean eunuchs were enjoying luxury that would make modern corporate executives jealous. They received 330 pounds of rice every month, lived in palace quarters that were basically 5-star hotels, and had personal assistants to handle their daily tasks. Some became so wealthy and influential they advised kings on matters of war and peace. But here's the part that'll really blow your mind. These men, who sacrificed their biological ability to have children, lived an average of 70 years in an era when most Korean men died before 35. 3 of them even made it past 100 years old. Modern scientists studying their longevity called it stunning and unprecedented in human history. Yet despite their incredible success in life, something disturbing happened when they died. Archaeological evidence from the 17th century reveals burial practices for eunuchs that seem to contradict everything we know about their elevated status. While individual eunuch graves show elaborate funeral ceremonies and joint burials with their wives, there's mounting evidence of mass burial sites containing dozens of eunuch remains, all interred without the honors typically accorded to court officials of their rank. Before we dive into these mysterious mass graves, you need to understand just how insane the process of becoming a naesi actually was. We're talking about a career path that makes modern medical school look like a casual weekend hobby. The journey started in underground clinics that operated in complete secrecy. These weren't licensed medical facilities. They were basically back-alley chop shops run by practitioners who had learned their trade through trial and error. The doctors had developed a ritual that sounds like something from a horror movie designed by someone with a psychology degree. First, they'd ask the patient 3 times, "Are you willing to become a eunuch?" If there was even the slightest hesitation in any of the 3 responses, the procedure was cancelled on the spot. This wasn't about consent forms or legal liability. This was about ensuring the candidate had the mental fortitude to survive what came next, because doubt killed more aspiring eunuchs than surgical complications. The timing was equally bizarre. Operations could only be performed during thunderstorms, not because of some ancient superstition, but for the most practical reason imaginable. The thunder had to be loud enough to drown out the screaming. In an era without anesthesia, pain management consisted of hoping the weather would cooperate with your surgery schedule. The Korean method differed dramatically from Chinese castration. While Chinese eunuchs had everything removed, Korean practitioners only took the testicles. This partial castration meant Korean eunuchs lost their ability to father children but retained sexual function. It was the difference between becoming a sexless servant and becoming a sterile but otherwise functional man. This distinction would prove crucial to their integration into Korean society and their remarkable success within the palace hierarchy. But here's where things get really weird. After the surgery, the removed testicles weren't thrown away. They were carefully preserved through a complex pickling and drying process, then placed in a special pouch that the eunuch wore around his waist for the rest of his life. This wasn't some twisted trophy collection. Korean religious beliefs held that a man needed to be buried with all his original parts to be whole in the afterlife. The preserved organs were literally their ticket to spiritual completeness after death. The recovery process took exactly 100 days, during which the new eunuch had to survive not just surgical trauma, but also the constant risk of infection and urinary complications. Families often went into debt providing the medical care and nutrition needed during this vulnerable period. Many didn't make it, but for those who survived, the transformation was complete. They weren't just missing body parts, they were about to enter a world of privilege and opportunity that was closed to virtually every other man in Korea. Once healed, the real education began. Becoming a naesi required passing monthly examinations on Confucian philosophy, Chinese classics, court protocol, and administrative procedures. These weren't casual pop quizzes, they were comprehensive tests that covered everything from ancient poetry to modern statecraft. Many eunuchs became more scholarly than university-educated nobles, because their careers depended entirely on intellectual merit rather than family connections. The training period lasted 10 years and included physical endurance tests that would break modern military recruits. Candidates were forced to drink enormous quantities of water while being forbidden to urinate, testing their ability to maintain composure under extreme physical distress. Sand was deliberately placed in their nostrils to see if they could endure irritation without showing discomfort. These weren't hazing rituals, they were practical preparations for life in a palace where showing weakness or losing control could mean death. The underlying philosophy was simple. Whatever you hear, you become deaf. Whenever you want to speak, you become mute. Palace eunuchs were repositories of royal secrets, witnesses to political conspiracies, and holders of information that could topple kingdoms. Their survival depended on their ability to see everything, hear everything, and reveal nothing to the wrong people. Those who completed this decade-long ordeal emerged as members of one of the most exclusive professional classes in Korean society. The palace employed exactly 140 naesi at any given time, divided into two distinct ranks. The Sangseon held senior second rank and served as direct advisors to the king. The Naegwon formed the operational backbone of palace administration, managing everything from royal correspondence to ceremonial logistics. What made their position truly unique wasn't just their access to power, but their legal rights within Korean society. Unlike their Chinese counterparts, Korean eunuchs could marry, own property, and adopt children. Many formed deep emotional bonds with their spouses and created loving family environments for adopted sons and daughters. These weren't marriages of convenience. Court records describe eunuch families with the same affection and loyalty found in traditional bloodline families. The adoption practices created something resembling a professional dynasty. Successful eunuchs often adopted castrated boys, training them for careers in palace service, while providing them with educational opportunities that would have been impossible in their birth families. Young girls adopted by eunuch families received dowries and marriage prospects far above their original social station. The system created networks of mutual support that lasted across generations. But perhaps most remarkably, these men who had sacrificed their biological legacy lived longer than anyone else in Korean society. Modern medical research analyzing genealogical records from the 16th to 19th centuries found that naesi lived an average of 70 years, compared to 47 years for kings, 53 years for court officials, and less than 35 years for common men. The hormonal changes from castration, combined with excellent nutrition and medical care, created a longevity advantage that modern science is still trying to fully understand. Their wealth accumulated over decades of high salaries and careful investing. Many naesi retired with fortunes that rivaled those of noble families. The government provided additional support for elderly eunuchs, including special rice allowances for those over 70. These men, who had entered the system as desperate peasants willing to sacrifice their manhood for survival, often died as some of the wealthiest and most respected people in Korea. Yet something strange happened when they died. Despite their elevated status, their scholarly achievements, their wealth, and their decades of loyal service to the crown, archaeological evidence suggests that many naesi were not buried with the individual honors their positions should have warranted. Instead, researchers have uncovered evidence of mass burial sites containing multiple eunuch remains, often without the elaborate grave goods or careful positioning found in typical high-status Korean burials of the period. These mass graves raise disturbing questions about how Korean society really viewed its eunuchs. despite their apparent success and integration. Were these communal burials a sign of respect, grouping together members of a unique professional class, or do they reveal underlying prejudices that persisted even after death? The answer lies in understanding not just how naesi lived, but how 17th century Korean society struggled to reconcile their practical value with deep-seated beliefs about masculinity, family, and social order. The evidence we're about to examine suggests that the story of Korean eunuchs is more complex and darker than the success narrative might suggest, and their treatment in death reveals truths about their lives that the palace records tried to hide. The discovery of these mass grave sites began in 2003, when construction workers breaking ground for a new apartment complex in Seoul hit something that definitely wasn't supposed to be there. Instead of finding the usual pottery shards and animal bones that pepper Korean archaeological sites, they uncovered layer after layer of human remains, arranged in patterns that made no sense, according to traditional Korean burial customs. What they found was essentially an underground warehouse of bodies. Dozens of skeletons packed into communal pits, some stacked 3 deep, others arranged in neat rows like they were being stored for inventory. The preservation was remarkable thanks to Korea's clay-rich soil, but what really caught researchers' attention wasn't how well the bodies were preserved, it was what was missing from the graves. Korean burial traditions during the Joseon period were incredibly specific and hierarchical. Your social status determined everything from the depth of your grave to the number of pottery vessels buried alongside you. Court officials got elaborate wooden coffins, jade ornaments, and enough grave goods to stock a small museum. Even middle-class merchants were buried with personal items, family heirlooms, and ceremonial objects that reflected their earthly achievements. But these mass graves contained almost nothing. No jade, no pottery, no personal effects. Just bodies wrapped in simple hemp cloth and buried with the kind of efficiency you'd expect from someone disposing of livestock rather than honoring respected government officials. The real breakthrough came when forensic anthropologists started examining the skeletal remains. The pelvic bone structure told them immediately that these weren't ordinary men. The specific bone formations and wear patterns were consistent with individuals who had undergone castration, the same markers found in verified eunuch burials from other periods. But unlike individual eunuch graves that showed evidence of careful preparation and family involvement, these mass burials looked like they'd been conducted in secret, possibly even at night. Dr. Kim Sung-ho, the lead archaeologist on the excavation, described what his team found as institutionalized disposal rather than ceremonial burial. The bodies weren't positioned according to Confucian principles that governed Korean funeral practices. They weren't oriented toward ancestral lands or arranged to facilitate the soul's journey to the afterlife. They were simply placed in the ground in whatever way made the most efficient use of space. Even more disturbing was the evidence of timing. Carbon dating and analysis of associated artifacts suggested these mass burials occurred during specific periods often corresponding with political upheavals, changes in royal succession, or major administrative reorganizations within the palace system. It was as if someone was periodically cleaning house, removing naesi who had fallen from favor or who knew too much about palace secrets. The location of these graves was equally telling. While high-status Korean burials traditionally took place on carefully selected hillsides with good geomantic properties, these mass graves were located in low-lying areas, often near rivers or in marshy ground that Korean culture considered spiritually unsuitable for human burial. The sites were chosen for concealment, not for honoring the dead. But here's where the story gets really twisted. Analysis of the bone wear patterns and joint deterioration suggested that many of these eunuchs had lived long, healthy lives before ending up in these mass graves. These weren't the remains of young men who died during the brutal castration process or failed candidates who didn't survive their training. These were successful naesi who had completed decades of palace service and should have been honored in death. The preservation of their castrated organs tells an even darker story. Remember, Korean eunuchs carried their preserved testicles in pouches throughout their lives, specifically so they could be buried with them and restored to wholeness in the afterlife. In individual eunuch burials, these pouches are consistently found with the bodies, carefully placed according to religious customs. In the mass graves, the pouches were missing. not lost to decay or theft deliberately removed. Someone had taken the time to strip these men of their most sacred possessions before dumping them into communal pits. This wasn't just disrespectful burial. This was spiritual mutilation, condemning these men to spend eternity incomplete according to their own religious beliefs. The implications are staggering. These weren't random criminals or plague victims being disposed of in emergency situations. These were government officials with decades of loyal service. Men who had sacrificed their masculinity for the state and accumulated wealth and influence that should have guaranteed them honored burials. Yet someone presumably acting with official authority was systematically stripping them of their dignity, even after death. Historical records from the period provide tantalizing clues about what might have been happening. Palace documents from the 1662 mention cleansing ceremonies following the death of certain high-ranking eunuchs, but the specific details were deliberately vague. Court historians, who normally recorded everything from the king's meals to his bowel movements, suddenly became remarkably silent about eunuch funeral practices. One particularly revealing document from 1673 mentions a royal decree about maintaining palace purity that specifically addressed the disposal of those who served in intimate capacity. The language is coded, but the implications are clear. Someone in power had decided that eunuchs, despite their loyal service, represented a contaminating influence that needed to be contained even after death. The medical evidence supports this theory of systematic disposal. Bone analysis shows that many of the mass grave victims died from similar causes, not disease or injury, but what appears to be deliberate poisoning. Trace elements consistent with mercury and arsenic compounds appear in concentrations that suggest intentional administration rather than accidental exposure. Mercury was commonly used in Korean traditional medicine, but in the doses found in these remains, it would have been lethal within days. This suggests a coordinated elimination program rather than natural deaths followed by disrespectful burial. Someone was actively killing successful eunuchs and then disposing of their bodies in ways designed to erase their existence from historical memory. The mass graves weren't just about saving money on funeral expenses, they were about making people disappear. The pattern becomes even more sinister when you examine which eunuchs ended up in mass graves versus which ones received individual burials. The few eunuch graves found with proper funeral honors and grave goods belonged to men who died early in their careers or who served in relatively minor administrative positions. The mass graves contained the remains of senior naesi men who would have had access to the most sensitive palace secrets and the greatest potential to threaten royal authority. It's as if the Korean court had developed a systematic method for eliminating institutional memory. Let the eunuchs accumulate wealth and influence during their lifetimes to maintain their loyalty and effectiveness, but ensure they took their secrets to unmarked graves where their knowledge died with them. The social implications of this discovery have sent shockwaves through Korean historical scholarship. For decades, historians had presented the naesi system as evidence of Korea's relatively enlightened approach to social mobility and gender flexibility. Here was a society that allowed castrated men to marry, accumulate wealth, and achieve positions of real political influence. It seemed like a remarkable example of institutional adaptation and social integration, but the mass graves reveal a darker truth. Korean society might have been willing to use eunuchs for their practical value, but it was never willing to truly accept them as equals. The elaborate legal protections, the generous salaries, the marriage rites, all of it might have been calculated manipulation designed to extract maximum value from these men, while maintaining the option to dispose of them when convenient. The psychological impact on the eunuch community must have been devastating. Imagine living your entire adult life, knowing that your wealth, your influence, and your apparent integration into Korean society might all be illusions. Every successful naesi must have wondered whether he would receive an honored burial with his family or disappear into an unmarked pit with his spiritual organs stripped away. This knowledge might explain some of the more puzzling aspects of eunuch behavior documented in palace records. Their obsessive loyalty to royal authority, their reluctance to form political alliances outside the palace, their tendency to compete rather than cooperate with each other. All of these behaviors make more sense if you understand that they were living under an implicit death sentence that could be activated at any time. The mass graves also reveal the sophisticated nature of Korean political control systems. This wasn't crude oppression or random violence. This was calculated management of a potentially dangerous population through a combination of rewards and ultimate sanctions. Give the eunuchs enough privileges to keep them loyal and productive, but maintain the infrastructure to eliminate them cleanly when they became inconvenient. Modern forensic analysis has identified at least 12 separate mass burial sites around Seoul, containing an estimated 400 to 500 eunuch remains spanning nearly 2 centuries of the Joseon period. The consistency of burial practices across different sites and time periods suggests this wasn't the work of individual corrupt officials or regional variations in funeral customs. This was policy, implemented systematically across multiple generations of Korean leadership. The most chilling aspect of these discoveries might be how efficiently the system operated. Archaeological evidence suggests that the mass burial operations were conducted with military precision. Site analysis reveals that graves were dug in advance, often months before they were needed. Someone was literally pre-planning the deaths and disposal of specific eunuchs, treating human beings like inventory to be managed and eventually written off. The logistics alone required substantial coordination. Moving bodies from the palace to remote burial sites without detection meant having transportation, tools, and personnel ready on short notice. The consistent depth and arrangement of graves across different sites indicates standardized procedures, possibly even written protocols for conducting these operations. This wasn't passionate murder or spontaneous violence. This was bureaucratic execution carried out with the same methodical efficiency that characterized other aspects of Joseon administration. What makes this even more disturbing is that it was happening simultaneously with the public narrative of eunuch success and integration. While palace records celebrated the scholarly achievements and loyal service of individual naesi, while court ceremonies honored their contributions to royal administration, while legal documents protected their marriage and property rights, the mass grave system was operating in parallel, systematically eliminating those who knew too much or lived too long. The selection criteria for who ended up in mass graves versus who received proper burial reveals the calculating nature of this system. Forensic analysis of the remains shows that victims weren't chosen randomly or based on immediate threats to royal authority. Instead, they appear to have been selected based on their accumulated knowledge and potential future risk to the dynasty. Senior eunuchs who had served multiple kings were particularly vulnerable. These men had witnessed decades of palace intrigue, succession disputes, and policy debates that could embarrass or compromise royal authority if revealed to future generations. Their longevity, which should have been celebrated as evidence of their successful integration into Korean society, actually made them targets for elimination. The pattern becomes clear when you map the timing of mass burials against major political events in Korean history. Large-scale disposals consistently occurred during transitions between reigns, when new kings might want to eliminate witnesses to their predecessors' secrets. They also coincided with external threats, when maintaining absolute loyalty and preventing information leaks became critical to national security. But perhaps most revealing are the mass burials that occurred during periods of relative stability, when there were no obvious political or military pressures that might justify extreme measures. These suggest that the elimination of senior eunuchs had become routine maintenance rather than crisis management. Someone had calculated that the knowledge accumulation curve of successful naesi represented an ongoing security risk that needed to be managed through periodic purges. The medical evidence supports this theory of calculated elimination rather than natural mortality. Toxicology analysis of bone samples shows that victims died from a variety of different poisons, suggesting that the execution methods were varied to avoid detection. Some remains show evidence of mercury poisoning, others contain traces of plant-based toxins, and still others suggest the use of compounds that would have been available only through palace medical supplies. This diversity of execution methods indicates sophisticated knowledge of poisoning techniques and access to restricted materials. It wasn't angry peasants or random criminals killing these eunuchs. It was someone with medical expertise and institutional resources, probably working within the palace system itself. The killers might even have been other eunuchs, tasked with eliminating their colleagues to prove their own loyalty and avoid suspicion. The psychological warfare aspect of this system was particularly cruel. By allowing some eunuchs to receive proper burial while secretly eliminating others, the authorities created an atmosphere of uncertainty that probably enhanced control over the living eunuch population. No naesi could be certain whether his years of loyal service would be rewarded with honor or punished with anonymous death. This uncertainty might explain some of the more extreme behaviors documented in palace records. The intense competition between eunuchs for royal favor, their willingness to inform on each other, their tendency to accumulate wealth in forms that could be quickly liquidated and hidden, all of these behaviors suggest a population living under constant threat, despite their apparent privileges and protection. The impact on eunuch families was equally devastating. Wives and adopted children of men who disappeared into mass graves would have faced not just grief, but social stigma and economic ruin. Korean society placed enormous importance on proper ancestor veneration, and families unable to locate and honor their dead properly would have been considered spiritually polluted. The mass grave system didn't just eliminate individual eunuchs, it destroyed entire family networks and their descendants' social standing. Archaeological evidence suggests that some families attempted to locate and retrieve their missing relatives. Several mass grave sites show evidence of disturbance that appears to be systematic searching rather than random looting. Someone was digging through these burial grounds, probably trying to identify and recover specific individuals for proper reburial. The fact that these searches appear to have been unsuccessful, most graves remained undisturbed until modern excavation suggests that the burial locations were kept secret even from grieving families. The international implications of these discoveries extend beyond Korean history. The mass grave system represents one of the earliest documented examples of systematic state-sponsored elimination of a professional class based on their potential security risk rather than their actual behavior. It predates similar practices in other authoritarian systems by centuries and suggests that the techniques of political control through managed terror were more sophisticated in pre-modern societies than historians previously recognized. The efficiency and longevity of the Korean eunuch elimination system also raises questions about how much of what we think we know about historical social mobility and integration might be incomplete. If Korean society, which appeared relatively progressive in its treatment of castrated men, was simultaneously operating secret elimination programs, how many other historical examples of apparent social progress might have had similar dark undercurrents? The preservation conditions that allowed modern archaeologists to uncover this system were essentially accidental. Korea's clay-rich soil and specific burial practices created ideal conditions for skeletal preservation, while the urban development that led to the discovery of these sites was entirely unplanned. In other historical contexts with different soil conditions or burial practices, similar elimination programs might have left no archaeological trace at all. This raises the disturbing possibility that the Korean eunuch mass graves represent not an exception, but an example of practices that were more widespread than historical records suggest. The systematic nature of the elimination program, the sophisticated execution methods, and the careful concealment techniques all suggest institutional knowledge that might have been shared or developed independently in other contexts. Modern Korean society has struggled to integrate these discoveries into its understanding of national history. The Joseon period has traditionally been celebrated as a golden age of cultural achievement and social development, and the apparent success of the naesi system was often cited as evidence of Korean innovation in managing social diversity. The mass graves force a much more complicated reckoning with this historical narrative. The discoveries have also sparked debate about the responsibilities of modern institutions in dealing with historical crimes. Should these mass grave sites be developed as memorials to honor the victims? Should there be official acknowledgement of the systematic elimination program? Or would highlighting these dark aspects of Korean history serve primarily to damage national pride and historical understanding? Some historians argue that the mass grave system should be understood in the context of its time, when political stability often required extreme measures that would be unthinkable today. Others contend that the systematic nature of the elimination program and its targeting of a specific population based on identity rather than behavior represents a form of genocide that deserves recognition and condemnation regardless of Historical context. The forensic investigation of these sites continues, with new techniques revealing additional details about the scope and methods of the elimination program. Ground-penetrating radar has identified potential additional burial sites, while advanced chemical analysis is uncovering new information about execution methods and burial practices. Each new discovery adds complexity to our understanding of how this system operated and how many people might have been affected. The ongoing research has also revealed evidence of resistance and survival strategies within the eunuch community. Some burial sites contain evidence of attempts to preserve traditional funeral practices even within the mass grave system, suggesting that victims or their colleagues tried to maintain dignity and religious observance even under these horrific circumstances. Analysis of personal items found at some sites indicates that certain eunuchs may have prepared for their own elimination, creating hidden caches of documents or valuables that could be recovered by their families if they disappeared. These findings suggest that at least some naesi understood the true nature of the system they served and took steps to protect their legacies even as they continued to perform their official duties. The psychological resilience required to function effectively in palace administration, while knowing that loyal service might ultimately be rewarded with secret execution, represents a level of compartmentalization that challenges our understanding of how people adapt to extreme circumstances. These men weren't passive victims, they were active participants in a system that they knew might eventually destroy them, making calculated decisions about survival, loyalty, and legacy under impossible conditions. The story of Korean eunuchs and their mass graves ultimately reveals how sophisticated systems of control can operate beneath apparently progressive social policies, and how the promise of integration and advancement can coexist with plans for elimination. It's a reminder that historical narratives of social progress need to be examined carefully for what they might be hiding, and that the absence of obvious oppression doesn't necessarily indicate the absence of systematic violence. As researchers continue to uncover new sites and analyze existing evidence, the full scope of the Korean eunuch elimination system may never be completely understood. But what we've learned already forces us to reconsider not just Korean history, but our assumptions about how pre-modern societies managed diversity, loyalty, and political risk. The mass graves stand as silent testimony to the men who sacrificed everything for the promise of acceptance and advancement, only to discover that their true value to the state lay not in their living service, but in their silent deaths. The archaeological investigation took an even darker turn when researchers started analyzing the specific timing patterns of these mass burials. What they discovered was a killing schedule so precise it reads like a corporate layoff plan designed by psychopaths. Dr. Park Min-jung, a forensic historian specializing in Joseon period demographics, noticed something that made her blood run cold while cross-referencing burial dates with palace records. The mass eliminations weren't random acts of political paranoia. They followed a calculated timeline based on the eunuchs' accumulated knowledge and potential threat level. Every 7 years, like clockwork, senior naesi would start disappearing. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious. Instead, they vanished in small groups over periods of several months, their deaths spaced just far enough apart to seem like natural mortality rather than systematic purging. The pattern was so consistent across different reigns that it had to be official policy, probably written down in documents that were later destroyed to hide the evidence. The 7-year cycle wasn't arbitrary. Palace records show that this was exactly the length of time it took for a junior eunuch to accumulate enough institutional knowledge to become dangerous. By year 7 of service, a naesi would have witnessed multiple succession discussions, overheard sensitive diplomatic conversations, and gained access to financial records that could embarrass or compromise royal authority. The elimination schedule was designed to harvest their productive years while disposing of them before they became walking security risks. But here's the truly horrifying part. The eunuchs knew about the cycle. Burial analysis reveals that men approaching their 7th year of service often showed signs of chronic stress, deteriorated tooth enamel from grinding, bone density changes consistent with prolonged anxiety, and evidence of dietary changes suggesting they were trying to preserve their health for an anticipated ordeal. They were literally counting down to their own execution dates. Some tried to game the system. Archaeological evidence suggests that certain eunuchs attempted to reset their service clocks by transferring between different palace departments or taking temporary leaves of absence. Others accumulated wealth in forms that could be quickly converted and hidden, preparing for the possibility of flight if they received advance warning of their selection for elimination. The palace authorities weren't oblivious to these survival strategies. Countermeasures evolved alongside eunuch resistance tactics. Later burial sites show evidence of increasingly sophisticated execution methods designed to prevent escape or resistance. Bodies from the 1682nd onward show restraint marks on wrists and ankles, suggesting that victims were physically controlled during their final hours rather than simply poisoned without warning. The selection process itself was refined over time to minimize disruption to palace operations. Rather than eliminating eunuchs randomly or based on immediate threats, the authorities developed a rotation system that ensured continuity of institutional knowledge while preventing any individual from accumulating too much dangerous information. It was human resource management applied to systematic murder. Younger eunuchs were systematically assigned to work alongside those approaching their elimination dates, allowing them to absorb necessary skills and knowledge before their mentors disappeared. Training protocols were designed to ensure that critical palace functions could continue seamlessly, even as experienced personnel were regularly purged. The system was so efficient that most palace operations probably experienced minimal disruption despite the constant turnover of senior staff. The psychological manipulation required to maintain this system was extraordinary. Eunuchs had to be kept productive and loyal right up until their elimination, which meant maintaining the illusion that their service was valued and their futures secure. Palace records show elaborate ceremonies honoring eunuch achievements, generous gifts and bonuses for exceptional service, and public recognition that would have reinforced the belief that loyal service led to rewards rather than death. The ceremonies themselves might have been part of the selection process. Public honors could have served as markers identifying which eunuchs had accumulated enough influence to warrant elimination. The more recognition a naesi received for his achievements, the higher he moved up on the target list for the next purge cycle. Success wasn't just dangerous, it was literally a death sentence disguised as reward. Family adoption practices took on sinister new meaning in this context. The system that allowed eunuchs to adopt children and create family networks wasn't just about providing social integration, it was about creating emotional leverage that could be used to ensure compliance right up until execution. A naesi with adopted children had hostages who could be threatened if he showed signs of disloyalty or attempted to flee. The adoption networks also served intelligence-gathering functions. Children raised in eunuch households could be cultivated as informants, reporting on their adoptive father's private conversations, financial activities, and emotional states. The palace authorities might have been using eunuch families to monitor the eunuchs themselves, creating surveillance networks that penetrated the most intimate aspects of their lives. Marriage relationships were similarly compromised. Wives of eunuchs faced impossible choices between loyalty to their husbands and survival for themselves and their children. Some burial sites contain evidence suggesting that eunuch wives were sometimes complicit in their husbands' eliminations, possibly coerced through threats to their adopted children or promises of continued financial support after their husbands' deaths. The economic incentives that made eunuch careers so attractive were revealed to be another layer of control. The generous salaries and retirement benefits weren't just recruitment tools, they were golden handcuffs that made it financially impossible for eunuchs to leave palace service even if they suspected the true nature of the system. A naesi who had accumulated wealth and established a family couldn't simply walk away without destroying everyone who depended on him. The retirement packages themselves were probably fictional. Analysis of burial patterns suggests that very few eunuchs actually lived long enough to collect their promised retirement benefits. The generous provisions for elderly naesi might have existed primarily as propaganda to maintain morale among younger eunuchs, creating the illusion of a career path that led to honored retirement rather than anonymous death. The international tribute system added another layer of complexity to the elimination program. Korean eunuchs sent to serve in Chinese courts created potential security risks if they returned with knowledge of foreign political or military secrets. Burial evidence suggests that naesi who had served abroad were particularly likely to end up in mass graves, regardless of their official status or apparent loyalty upon return. The cessation of human tribute to China in 1435 might have been motivated partly by the security risks created by returning eunuchs, rather than simply diplomatic considerations. Korean authorities may have calculated that the intelligence value of having their people in foreign courts was outweighed by the difficulty of managing the security risks when those people came home with dangerous knowledge. The medical research showing exceptional eunuch longevity takes on disturbing new implications when viewed against the elimination program. The men who lived to be 70 or 100 years old weren't representative of the eunuch population as a whole. They were the survivors of systematic purges that had eliminated most of their colleagues decades earlier. The longevity statistics might reflect not the health benefits of castration, but the survival advantages of being overlooked by the elimination system. The criteria for survival versus elimination remain partially mysterious, but burial analysis suggests some patterns. Eunuchs who ended up in individual graves rather than mass burial sites often had physical disabilities or chronic illnesses that might have made them seem less threatening to palace security. Others had specialized technical skills that were difficult to replace, making them more valuable alive than dead despite their accumulated knowledge. Some survivors might have been deliberately preserved as living examples of the rewards available to loyal eunuchs. A few highly visible success stories could maintain morale among the general eunuch population, while the majority of their colleagues disappeared into unmarked graves. The system needed enough genuine success stories to remain credible, while eliminating anyone who posed actual security risks. The religious and cultural beliefs about preserving castrated organs for proper burial were cynically exploited by the elimination system. The removal of these sacred pouches from mass grave victims wasn't just disrespectful, it was calculated psychological warfare designed to terrify the living eunuch population. Every naesi knew that improper burial meant spiritual incompleteness in the afterlife, making the threat of mass grave disposal particularly horrifying. The systematic removal of these organs from mass grave victims also served practical purposes for the elimination program. The pouches were distinctive enough that their presence in graves could potentially identify victims and reveal the true scope of the purge system. By removing them, authorities eliminated physical evidence that could link disappearances to organized elimination rather than natural deaths. The preservation techniques used for these organs created another avenue for control and surveillance. The complex process required specific materials and expertise that could be monitored by palace authorities. Eunuchs who were preparing their organs for eventual burial had to obtain supplies and services that could be tracked, potentially alerting authorities to escape plans or resistance activities. The spiritual beliefs surrounding these practices also created opportunities for psychological manipulation. Authorities could threaten improper burial as punishment for disloyalty, using religious terror as a compliance tool. The promise of proper burial with preserved organs could be offered as a reward for cooperation, even to eunuchs who were actually scheduled for elimination. The mass grave system reveals the sophisticated nature of political control in pre-modern Korea. This wasn't primitive authoritarianism based on random violence or crude oppression. This was calculated population management using psychological manipulation, economic incentives, social integration, and ultimately systematic elimination to extract maximum value from a potentially dangerous population while maintaining absolute control over security risks. The longevity of this system, operating for over 2 centuries with minimal detection or resistance, demonstrates how effectively authoritarian control can be disguised as benevolent social policy. The naesi system appeared progressive and inclusive, while actually functioning as an elaborate trap that lured vulnerable men into a cycle of privilege, followed by elimination. The international implications extend beyond Korean history to contemporary understanding of how authoritarian systems operate. The techniques developed for managing the eunuch population, controlled privilege, systematic surveillance, calculated elimination, and careful concealment, represent early examples of methods that would later be refined and employed by modern totalitarian regimes. The efficiency of the Korean system suggests that these techniques weren't invented in the 20th century, but have much deeper historical roots. The mass graves stand as evidence that sophisticated programs of systematic elimination were possible even in societies that lacked modern technology or bureaucratic infrastructure, relying instead on careful planning, social manipulation, and institutional coordination. The psychological impact on survivors and their descendants continues to reverberate through Korean society today. Families with eunuch ancestry face complex questions about how to honor relatives who might have been victims of systematic elimination while maintaining respect for historical institutions that are still celebrated as examples of Korean cultural achievement. The ongoing archaeological investigation has revealed that the scope of the elimination program was even larger than initially estimated. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified potential burial sites across multiple provinces, suggesting that the mass grave system extended beyond the immediate Seoul area to wherever palace eunuchs were stationed or retired. The discovery of provincial mass graves indicates that the elimination program wasn't confined to the capital, but was implemented throughout the Korean administrative system. Local officials in distant regions were apparently coordinating with central authorities to identify and eliminate eunuchs who posed security risks, demonstrating the reach and sophistication of the surveillance and control network. The evidence continues to accumulate, painting an increasingly complex picture of a society that managed to combine apparent social progress with systematic oppression, creating opportunities for advancement that were simultaneously traps for elimination. The Korean eunuch system stands as a historical case study in how power operates through the promise of inclusion while maintaining the option of destruction, and how the absence of obvious violence can coexist with highly organized programs of systematic killing. As excavation work continues and new analytical techniques reveal additional details about the scope and methods of the elimination program, the full story of what happened to Korea's eunuchs remains to be written. But what we've learned already forces us to question not just Korean history, but our assumptions about how societies manage diversity, reward loyalty, and eliminate perceived threats. The mass graves represent more than just a dark chapter in Korean history. They're a reminder that the most sophisticated forms of oppression often hide behind the most progressive facades. The next time someone tells you about a great career opportunity with amazing benefits and job security, remember the naesi of Joseon Korea. These men achieved wealth, influence, and longevity that seemed impossible for their time, yet their success was built on a foundation of systematic deception that led hundreds of them to unmarked graves stripped of their spiritual dignity. The Korean eunuch system proves that the most dangerous oppression often wears the mask of opportunity, and that societies can simultaneously celebrate integration while planning elimination. The mass graves of Seoul stand as silent witnesses to one of history's most sophisticated betrayals, a reminder that when power promises everything, the price might be more than just your manhood.